Today we're going to talk about repairing a window regulator that does not operate properly or moves too slowly. We're going to talk about how to check the window switch to make sure that it's receiving power and that it's operating properly. Talk about checking the window pivot, the lift pivot, the regulator cable, the window stop, the motor bushings, and the motor itself. Now the first thing that we want to do is check the switch operation with a multimeter. Now we're going to want to make sure that it's receiving power and also that it operates properly. Now the procedures for doing this can be found in the repair manual information in the microfiche. Now if the switch is operating properly, then we have to take the regulator out of the door, bring it to the bench, and repair it. Now with the window regulator on the bench, the first thing that we should look at is the window lift cable. If it's frayed in any place, then we'll have to replace the whole window regulator. If the cable is okay, the next thing we should check is the lift pivot. We want to check and see if it's attached securely to the lift cable. If it's loose, like this one is, we can get these swivel pins from the parts department and cut about a 2 millimeter wide groove in them. Now this tungsten carbide rod saw works real good for something like this. Now once we have the groove cut about halfway through here, we can take this swivel pin and put it on the cable like so, and then run the swivel pin right up tight against the lift pivot and tighten it down. Now we'll want to do the same thing on the other side, one on each side, to fix this lift pivot firmly to the lift cable. Now the next thing we should look at is this window stop here. If this is cracked or loose or missing, replace it with a new one. Next, take a look at these mounts here for the window motor. If they're cracked, loose, or separated, replace them with new ones. Now if the problem on the regulator that you're working on is that the motor doesn't operate, you can either replace or rebuild the motor. Separate motors are available. However, in the majority of cases, the problem can be fixed simply by rebuilding the motor, and we're going to cover that procedure here today. Now before we get started separating the housing here and taking the motor off, we want to take a couple tie wraps and put one on each end of the spool assembly here where the cables enter. Now this will help keep the two upper housings together when we separate them and save us some grief later on down the road. Put them on tight. And again, put one on each end. And cut the excess off. Now we can take our screws off that hold the two housings together. Now you're either going to find posi drive or Torx head screws here. Now, once you get all the screws out, we're going to separate these two housings of this spool assembly. We want to make sure that the spool stays in the top half. If the spool comes out, the cable will unwind, and that's a two-man job to get it back together again. So a little bit of caution can save you a little bit of trouble here. And once you've got all the screws out, rock the two housings to get them loose. And once you get a little bit of a gap, take your screwdriver and put it in between the housing and the gasket. Put it all the way in there. And this will hold the spool in this upper housing here. Then carefully try to separate the two housings. And this is what I was talking about here. We want to make sure that this spool assembly here stays in this upper housing. Again, if you're not careful, when you separate the two housings, this will stay on the motor drive gear and the cable will all become unwound. And then you're in for a two-man job to put it back together. Now, with that off, we can just set it aside and concentrate on the motor assembly now. Take the gasket off. We can take our drive gear out. One of the things that we want to look at is this shaft here that the drive gear rides on. We want to inspect it for any corrosion or pitting. If it is pitted, we can sand it with 400, clean it, and grease it when we reassemble the motor assembly. Now we want to separate the motor from this drive housing here. 2 Phillips screws here on the end. Now after you get the screws out, you may find that the motor doesn't want to separate from the housing. If that's the case, make sure you don't pry on the end of the armature right here with a screwdriver, because that could damage the armature. Simply rock the housing to try to get it to separate or loosen. If it still won't loosen, then you can go in with a screwdriver and simply pry between the housing and the motor housing. But make sure you stay on the metal. Don't pry on this white bush holder, or brush holder rather, for the motor. So you can rock the two and get it to separate. And while you're separating the motor from the drive housing, make sure you don't lose track of this white bushing. When you reassemble the motor, you want to make sure that that goes back in its proper place. And we can take the motor out of the drive housing and then pull the armature along with the brush holder out of the motor housing. Once that's out, one of the things we want to look at is the magnets inside the motor housing. We want to check and make sure that they aren't flaking or cracked like this is here. If it is, we'll have to replace the entire motor. And as I said earlier, the motor is available separately. Another thing that we want to look at on the motor are the brushes in here. Now, if the brushes are stuck or broken, again, we'll have to replace the entire motor. But if they aren't stuck or they aren't broken, then we can reuse them and reuse the motor probably. The last thing that we're concerned with the motor is the armature itself. We want to make sure that the shaft's not pitted or corroded. We want to take a close look at the commutator here. We can clean it using the eraser from a pencil. Once you've got all the contacts cleaned, you want to go between the commutator grooves with a toothpick to clean out the residue. And now once we're finished that, we're ready to clean and reassemble the motor and the window regulator. Once we've cleaned all the components of the window motor and drive assembly, we can begin to lubricate and assemble the components. Now we've cleaned the motor housing, the drive gears, and the drive housing using a mild solvent such as brake clean. We cleaned the commutators on the armature shaft with a pencil eraser and cleaned out between all the grooves with a toothpick. And last, we cleaned these brushes with contact cleaner, an electrical contact spray. Now once we've got all these things cleaned, we're ready to start reassembly and lubricating the components as we reassemble them. Now for that, we want to use this special grease, G45, that's available from the parts department. And it's especially for window regulators and window motors. Before we start lubricating though, it's a good idea to take our brush assembly and place it over the commutator on the armature. It's easier to do it now than with the armature installed in the motor. So simply compress the brushes a little bit and get them in place on the commutator. Then we can take some of our grease and grease this end of the armature shaft before we put it in the motor housing. Don't put too much grease on, but also don't be afraid to put a little bit on there. Now, take the whole assembly and put it in the motor housing. You want to make sure you line up the portion where the wires go into the brush holder with this recess here in the motor housing. Now slide the two together, and be careful your brush holder doesn't slip off the armature. And make sure the armature goes all the way into the motor housing. Right now the bushing's not seated fully. So we'll take a rag and make sure it's seated all the way like that. It should look like this when it's in all the way. Now we can take some more of our special grease and lubricate this portion of the armature shaft. And again, don't be afraid to put some grease on here, but don't go overboard with it as well. Now once we've got our shaft greased up, we can reinstall the motor into the drive housing. Now, when you took this thing apart, if this bushing happened to come out, if it stayed on the armature shaft, simply reinstall it into the housing using the original retainer. And before we get our motor all the way into the housing, don't forget our plastic bushing that goes on the other end. This goes right in here, like this. And then install the motor, and we can put our screws in place. Come a little. There we go. Now don't tighten these down all the way, just draw them up snug, because we may want to line up the motor later on after we get the whole assembly together. Now before you assemble the two halves, before you assemble this half with the spool drive and the regulator, there's one thing that you should be aware of. Now there's an easy way to put the two halves together. The way to do that is to let the regulator and the spool assembly lay on the bench and to place the motor onto it. Now that'll reduce the possibility of us displacing this spool here. Now before we start, we want to lubricate everything properly. So we'll lubricate the spool. Make sure that's got plenty of grease. Then we can install the drive plate. We'll have to line up these drive pegs with these little rubber cushions inside here. It's not always the easiest thing to do. We place our damper assembly over that. Don't forget the gasket. Put it on now. And we can put our drive gear in place, and we'll want to lubricate that. A little bit of lubrication here and all the way around the teeth. And we can set that in place. Now before we place our motor on the assembly, we'll want to put a little grease here on the pivot itself for the drive gear. And now we can install the motor onto the regulator drive assembly. You may have to rock it a little bit to get it to line up, but once the two are together, hold the two pieces so they don't come apart and rotate the whole housing over. And now we can install our screws. Now, while we're tightening our screws, it's a good idea to tighten them diagonally so that the two housings go together evenly. And once we get the screws tightened and the housings together, we're going to want to test this regulator. And it's definitely a good idea to test it before you get it installed in the door, because if you have a problem, then that means you've got to take it back out again. Now, you can do this using either the power supply from the car, just hook it up to the switch before you get it installed in the door, or if you have a power supply like we have here, you can test it right on the bench. Now there's two things we're going to look for. One is to make sure that the motor operates smoothly. That's one of the reasons why I left these screws just a little loose. And the second is we want to make sure we have full travel of the pivot assembly. Now, we turn the power supply on. check to see that it operates both ways. It looks like it's okay. If the motor was a little noisy, what I would have done is moved it around until I got it to operate at the quietest point. And then I can tighten my 2 screws here. Now this window regulator is ready to be installed back in the car. In summary, when working on a window regulator that does not operate as it should, check to see that you have power at the switch and check the switch operation. Check the regulator drive cable. Make sure the lifter pivot is secure to the cable. Inspect the window stop for wear. Inspect the window motor bushings. Take apart the window motor. If you do take it apart, be careful when separating the housings so that the cable does not unwind from the spool. Clean and inspect the parts. If you have to replace the window motor, they are available as a separate part. Lubricate using the special G45 grease. This is a special grease that does not harden or thicken at colder temperatures.